right in the So we're right in the middle of Black History Month, and UCC Racial Justice Sunday is usually situated on the second Sunday of Black History Month. And so just as a point of information, all of our worship music, with the exception of our Song of the Month, is coming to us from Black gospel and Black songwriters. And so it may be music that we're not as familiar with, but I wanted to uplift that, especially on this Sunday, as Black streams of Christianity are both foundational to the United Church of Christ in ways that we don't talk about a whole lot, but also have just rich strength and resources to offer the progressive Christianity in general and the Christian faith. So I think it's important to center, especially on this Sunday. So this text, I've talked about it before. Anytime Peter comes up, I'm like, yeah, I get that guy. He's like the Johnny on the spot. Anybody needs something done, usually if you need something wrecked, he's right there. You know, he's the my friend, the former associate conference minister Anthony Scott. He called Peter the cussin' and the cuttin' saint, and I resonate with that a lot. But we see a different side of Peter. So today you see actually Peter's fear today in a way that I think is really instructive for us, especially as we're talking about racial justice and the work for collective liberation. So. At the beginning of this text, Jesus asks this provocative question, what do people call me? What do they think is going on here? And everyone says, well, we're finding, kind of an archetype that you are falling into, the archetype of the prophet, right? So we saw John the Baptist, and he was out in the wilderness and causing some havoc and saying the hard things, and people are like, well, maybe you're kind of like him, or maybe there's Elijah. And we remember back a couple of months ago, we had the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And so Elijah also was this, hardcore, speak truth to power, like, I'm going to take on the whole world because of what I believe is right kind of guy. And so, and then Jesus is like, okay, so that's what kind of they say. They're finding me in this larger story of faith of our Jewish siblings and kind of current events. Like, we kind of have a schema for what is going on here. But who do you say that I am? And they say, you are the Messiah. You are the anointed one. You are the chosen one of God, right? What that does is that sets Jesus apart in an even separate category, right? So not only is Jesus a prophet who is coming to disrupt these ways of knowing that are popular at the time, these systems of oppression, these systems of power that are keeping people on the outskirts of acceptable society. They're saying, yeah, well, the prophets, we were able to ignore them. Right? Abraham Joshua Heschel said that the prophets are an octave too high. No offense to our resident soprano. Right? But that they're saying the things that people are thinking, but they're just really shrill about it. Right? And why can't they just tone it down? Right, and so because they are too loud, or they're too messy, or they're too weird, or their acts of public defiance are just too much, we can kind of put them in a box and say, okay, well, that's them doing that stuff over there. John the Baptist is out in the wilderness, and if I want to go see him, maybe I will go seek him out. But then calling Jesus the anointed one makes him something we can't ignore. Oh, this is actually the guy who's coming to save us. And he's saying all this stuff that makes him kind of sound like a prophet, but he's in the city center. And he's grabbing my attention, and he's saying I have to follow him. And I left everything. Peter, he left his boats. He was a fisherman. And And there is a claim on me because this person, this Jesus, is something more, something I can't ignore, and might just be the key to my liberation. Especially under Roman occupation, liberation was something very physical and tangible. There was an occupying army just sort of standing menacingly, and if you stepped a toe out of line, you would get violently murdered. And I find it really interesting that at the end of this text, Jesus says, take up your cross. But this is chapters before Jesus himself was actually crucified. The cross was a symbol of terror and fear. He knew that if he was going to follow this way of life, it would cost him and his followers their lives. That was a public punishment. People were made examples of if they stepped out of line, if they did anything that the Romans didn't approve of. That's what happens to you. The most grisly death we can come up with. So crap. We have a prophet in the city center, and we think he's our guy, and we think he's going to liberate us, and we think he's going to save us, but, whoa, what are the costs? That's scary. I've got something to lose here. And enter pragmatic Peter, right? Or we think that he's pragmatic Peter. He's actually terrified Peter, but lots of times we dress up our terror and our anxiety as just asking questions, right? I just want to make sure that everything is okay, right? Like I just want to, is this the logical way, right? Like we have this gnawing terror in our bellies that is not letting us sleep at night. Our anxiety keeps us awake, but then when we go into our daily lives, we dress it up in a business suit and say, well, that's just not reasonable. And so we don't get to hear what Peter says. All we hear is Peter rebuked him, right? Rebuked Jesus. And I think, rebuke, that's like such a strong word, right? Like when I'm being rebuked, I'm like, there's the finger wag, and there's the like, someone's probably taller than me, and like I suddenly feel about 6 years old, right? Like this is not the way. Right? And so Peter, full of his self-righteous anxiety, takes Jesus aside and goes, listen, you're about to get us all killed. Is this what you want? I mean, this is my fictionalized, right, like imagining what it was that Peter was saying, right? And isn't that something that we recognize ourselves in Peter? There is the thing that may just get us free. And we are terrified of it because it might also cost us everything we know about our lives. And so instead of sitting with his own anxiety and discomfort and trusting that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, which he had just said out loud like 3 verses before, Peter's like, no, this is not how this works. Let me tell you how this works. You got to tone it down. You got to go for incremental change. You can't ask for reparations. You can't do anything that would make the police angry at you. You have to be respectable. You have to be nice. You can't be too prophetic, definitely not in the city square. And then what does Jesus say? Also, we hear the word rebuke. Get behind me, Satan. Which, let me contextualize that a little bit. Okay, so Satan is not like the red guy with the horns with the forked tail. That came from Dante. That is not actually biblical. So no lakes of fire here. But in the Hebrew Bible, the Satan is the Hebrew word. That is the adversary. It is the stumbling block. It is the person who is in your way, which honestly is what Peter's doing. He's in Jesus' way. Jesus is very clear about what his work in the world is. He is healing people. He is welcoming people back into the center of care of the community, that those who had power said, no, you belong on the margins. Jesus knew what he was about. We've spent weeks talking about how Jesus literally touched those that society had deemed untouchable. And here's Peter being like, you maybe should touch them less. That's going to get you in trouble. The chief priests are going to be mad if you disrupt their pipeline of profit. They really like it when people are ritually unclean, because that means that people get to pay them money. And you can't disrupt capitalism. You can't disrupt power. And Jesus says, okay, that's nice. If you're going to be in my way, I need you to be behind me. I got stuff to do. And if you can't do it, at least don't stop me. And then we get the adulterous generation, which is another like, oof, that's a pretty fine point on it. And sexual immorality or sexual promiscuity is used as a metaphor throughout the Bible, which we may or may not have that same lens on what it means to be intimate with someone else. But what I read that as meaning is like, listen, you can't have it both ways. Either you are picking up your cross and you are following me, and you are stepping on all of the toes of all of the people in power, whether that is the Roman magistrates or the people in religious authority who are in their pockets. Either you are in it with me, or you're in my way. We can't have this both in this moment, when people's lives are on the line, when healing is at stake, when liberation is on the line. We can't have anxiety dressed up in a business suit. We can't have your fear masking itself as just being reasonable. We can't have incremental change. We need to radically shift how we organize our lives together. And we are doing something here. And yeah, it's scary. And yeah, it's calling us out from beyond ourselves. And yeah, it's asking you to leave behind the things you thought that you knew, the things that protect you. And also, the only way out is through. And isn't that the work of collective liberation? Isn't that the work of true, actual justice? Aren't the things that Peter said to Jesus, as we imagine them in this text, things that white people say to black folks all the time? Well, if you just follow the law, if you would just keep your nose clean, if you would have just not been speeding, if you had just not had your tail light out, if you just were white, maybe you'd be safe. That's what we're saying. And yet, we are called to follow Black leaders in this movement for racial justice, because they know something we don't. The people on the margins in Jesus' time knew something that the people at the center didn't. The person who spent the time living in the tombs knew something about what it meant to be captive and what it meant to be free. And we had things to learn from that. The woman who was ill for 12 years, who could not live in polite society because her body had betrayed her and there was no healing to be found anywhere else except through Jesus. She knew something about the violences of the religious system that was keeping her apart from literally everyone she loved. So of course she's going to take up her cross because she's got nothing to lose, because this system was never meant for her. And so she is the person that Jesus brings back to the center and says, learn from these people. They can tell you where all the flaws are. Yeah, this is how the system is supposed to work on paper, but this is how it's actually working for people. And if we've never experienced that in our bodies, we don't get to say it's not real. But we need to not be Peters in this moment. To let our fear mask itself as just being reasonable. Because that is what undermines actual solidarity. If we keep choosing the system as it is, because we are afraid to imagine what life could be without it, how we might carve out a space that is different, even in our own midst. If we never try on that imaginative possibility and instead we let our fear override our relationship with those who have different experiences of this system. If we say, hey, tone it down, you're scaring me. I don't even know that Peter had access to be able to say, you're scaring me. He just knew he needed it to stop. Right? We don't talk about that. We don't say that stuff too loud. You're in the middle of the city here. You were doing those healings out on the fringes, and that was okay. John the Baptist is out on the fringes, and that's okay. Elijah was kind of weird, and we were able to put him in a box, and then he went back out into the wilderness, but you're in the city now. But the city, right in the heart of how things are working, right in the heart of the system, that's where we need prophets the most. That's where we need to be the loudest. And there's a spiritual component there. Resmaa Menakem is a black therapist based in Minneapolis. And he wrote this book called My Grandmother's Hands. And it talks about why racism isn't cognitive, is actually embodied. Similar to the way that Peter got hijacked by his own fear and dressed it up as just being reasonable, that's what a lot of white folks do. Anytime the topic of race comes up, we shut ourselves off. We dissociate from our bodies, and we're not able to actually engage our own fear around the topic. Which is why whenever someone says, you've done something that's racist, we say, I'm not racist, because it means something about our being, our own ability, like our own goodness, that we might have harmed someone. And so rather than deal with guilt or fear around this topic, we shut it down and we push it aside, saying, you either misinterpreted my actions, or I didn't mean it that way, or that's just how life works. And so we allow ourselves off the hook in conversation around issues of liberation and justice. And so I wonder what might have happened if instead of being hijacked by his fear, which we know that Peter gets hijacked by a lot of stuff, his excitement, his anger, he's a pretty flighty nervous system, I'll say. which is funny because he winds up getting called the rock that the church gets built on a little later. But I think it's because he learned, right? We see Peter really battling it out within himself. Peter is the one disciple we see actually transform. And so I wonder what would have happened if Peter had access to his breath at that time. When Jesus is saying, all of this bad stuff is going to happen to me, and if you're going to follow me, it might happen, probably will happen to you too. And instead of being ruled by his fear, if Peter could just have taken a breath, said hello to that deep and abiding anxiety, which comes from somewhere specific, right? Because Peter's also living under occupation. He knows what the costs are. He's probably seen them borne out in other people's bodies, the people he loved. We don't know, but it stands to reason. That fear comes from somewhere. But if he could just say, yep, I'm terrified, what would that have done to shift the conversation? Because that would have been a different conversation with Jesus, right? So instead of, no, you can't do that, which is our defense mechanism so that we can make the fear go away, the discomfort go away, if he'd been in relationship with himself enough to know, this is scary. This is life-changing. This asks something of me, and I have doubt about it. I don't know if I'm actually able to do what you're asking of me. That's a whole different conversation than don't do that. That's something we can grow from. And so our breath is our simplest spiritual practice. And Resmaa Menakem in his book guides us back to our breath, guides us back to our bodies anytime we get activated. But the thing for most of us is that we're just floating heads. We sometimes don't even know we have feet, much less that anxiety is hijacking our nervous system. And so we build a relationship with our own bodies, with our own shadow emotions, with our own anger, with our own fear, with our own possibility of causing someone pain. When we look at those things that we'd rather avoid, that's how we actually get free. So that when our black siblings come to us and say, what you just said was really racist, instead of saying, no, it's not, I'm a good person, and having to defend that, we can come back to our breath. Say, oh, there's guilt again. There is my utter terror. Come back and say, tell me more about that. How do I make it right? Which again changes the conversation completely. We are on the precipice of Lent, which I know is not everyone's favorite time of year, because it's usually, you should feel bad. Why? I don't know, just because you're human, right? Like it's we start with, you're gonna die, right? Which is a great place to start. And then we're like, and you should feel guilty, and you should not have any pleasure for like 7 weeks, right? And then when we actually get to Easter, then you can have it, right? It's this time that is heavy, this time that is devoid of joy. And yet here's what I promise about looking at shadow, which is how we will be spending these next several weeks. With greed, with guilt, with anger, with fear. Here's what I promise, is if we actually come into relationship with those things, if we recognize them when they're showing up in our body, freedom is on the other side of that. Because then we don't get hijacked by it if we're in relationship with it. It becomes just a part of our experience, not our whole being, which actually allows us to experience full and embodied joy. So if you hang with me through Lent, Easter's gonna rock. Promise. But our work as white folks engaged in the work of racial justice, which is in the bones of this church, is work with our own bodies, with our own shadow, so that we don't make it our black siblings' problem. I imagine how Jesus must have felt. Ugh, here we are again, bumping up against the ways that the system is ingrained in Peter's body. Can't we get past this? Can't we actually be in relationship with one another? Can't you know your own stuff enough to not make it my issue? And Peter is a mess, but he's an honest mess. And by the end of the story, he's transformed. Because he feels his anger, he feels his fear, because he gets checked sometimes, every time, all the time. And that's what allows him to transform. And so here on this edge of Lent, my prayer for us is that we do not choose fear, that we do not allow it to hijack our systems, that we look at our own culpability, our own frailty, our own weaknesses, our own shadow emotion, and come into relationship with it so that it can be not only transformed, but redeemed. May we pick up our crosses. May we follow even into the shadow of our own soul, that we may come out the other side liberated and in solidarity. Amen.